almost every company we talk to is really shifting from that aspirational to achievable. It's not always as impressive, right? It doesn't allow you to say 100% or zero waste, but it's often more realistic. And so I think
What is the question on every business leader's mind right now? 3BL's video series with TriplePundit cuts through the chaos and helps you navigate responsible business. Each episode dives into the questions keeping leaders up at night, breaking down trends, cutting through noise, and uncovering what's really shaping the future.
Setting big sustainability goals used to be the default, but the increasing scrutiny on the sustainability space has some leaders asking, is it still worth it? Today, we're being joined by Laura Gitman, the Chief Impact Officer of BSR, to talk more about how companies can set meaningful goals that actually stick and how leaders can stay ambitious without losing stakeholder trust. Laura, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Diving right into things, it wasn't too long ago that not having a sustainable goal was considered to be a potential reputational risk. Now it seems some folks are wondering if setting goals in this area is risky for their organization. I wonder what you're hearing out there from the leaders in your network around this topic.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. We're hearing this question a lot from our members as they perceive more risk sort of from all sides. There's risk of setting goals, there's risk of not setting goals. If they have goals, is the side that is sort of really driving some of the backlash against ESG or sustainability? Is it going to get used as evidence in lawsuits? We're hearing on the other side concerns that it's really just seen as greenwashing. And so they have a lofty goal, but it doesn't really mean anything. And so I think the concern around goals is certainly elevated from 5 or more years ago when everybody was setting a round of goals in 2020.
And as we kind of think about goal setting going forward, we're hearing a little bit more talk out there about companies talking about, should we set goals, but maybe not talk about them, maybe not share these goals publicly. For companies that are worried about backlash, how do you feel about this? Is keeping the sustainability goals private? Is this a smart strategy, or could you potentially be missing opportunities there?
Yeah, I think we view it that it is still really important to have goals for a lot of reasons, but only some of those reasons are tied to their public nature. And so I think it's really important for companies to think about the purpose of those goals and whether or not being public is a part of that purpose. Companies have lots of targets that they use for internal management, to set strategy, to hold people accountable, that they don't make public for good competitive and market reasons. And so having sustainability goals be a part of that is okay. We also therefore encourage companies to be really thoughtful about when a public goal is valuable. So when do they need more than that internal accountability? And I would break that down really into two key areas. One is they need to collaborate externally. So either they're, trying to engage their value chain or trying to push an industry. You can't do that with a goal that is private and inside only your 4 walls. And so when external collaboration is important, that public goal is really a critical part of that. The second is when they need a big long-term vision or North Star in order to motivate others. And again, that's not needed on everything that a company does, but it is needed for some things. And we are hearing from some members that the lack of a long-term public goal is making it harder to secure longer-term budget. It's making harder to actually engage their employees because their employees don't know what the company is trying to accomplish. And so I'd say public goals are still valuable, but not in all cases, but be intentional about when you need that goal and for what purpose.
Absolutely. I think that context is so helpful, kind of thinking about sustainability goals similarly to other business goals. Some are really helpful to shout out about, to really get your stakeholders involved in, and some are more, for your own teams to really understand how you're tracking. I think that context is super helpful. And as you also alluded to a little bit, there are some people beyond political criticism that are kind of feeling frustrated about the state of sustainability goal setting, or hearing people set lofty goals for the future don't really seem to amount to real action. There's not a lot of reporting happening along the way. I wonder how you feel about how companies can get better at improving credibility and continuing to be transparent around their goals.
Yeah, I think this is a really fair criticism and sort of an appropriate maturing of the space, right? So, it used to be meaningful to set a goal in and of itself. That was progress, right? Now it's accomplishing the goal and really driving real meaningful progress. And so I think it's a really important evolution. I also think when you had 20 goals, it's really hard to make meaningful progress against all of them. And so I think a shift towards a smaller number of really focused goals that are truly tied to business strategy is going to enable real investment in the goals that you do have. And so I'm pleased actually to see some consolidation and increased focus for goal setting. I think that's going to help. I think the other thing that we're seeing a major shift on is a shift from perhaps aspirational goals to more realistic goals. We did some benchmarking and had a webinar on this topic with our members in February, and almost every company we talk to is really shifting from that aspirational to achievable. It's not always as impressive, right? It doesn't allow you to say 100% or zero waste, but it's often more realistic. And so I think as a community, we also have to be accepting of what that goal means, why it's important to be more realistic, and then to hold everybody accountable to actually achieving it. You can't set an achievable goal and then not have a real plan in place with which to achieve it. And that, I would say, is sort of the last piece, is that those goals have to be accompanied by what is the governance? What is the accountability? How are you driving internal change? What is the plan when it's off track? What are the dependencies that you're tracking, right? So it can't just be a goal and then say, okay, we're done, but it's a goal that's accompanied by a real implementation plan. And I think that's really important progress for the field.
That's such a great call out. Not long ago it was true. Setting the ambition, setting the intention with this big lofty target was viewed as progress in itself. And it really seems like stakeholder expectations have shifted. Folks want to hear what you're doing to make good on those promises and to move forward toward that goal. And in that same realm of kind of big questions, I'm hearing more people out there asking these days, are sustainability goals even the right tool for driving corporate progress in these areas anymore? Or do we need to maybe rethink that model entirely? I wonder what your thoughts are on it.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would say it's certainly not the only tool. And so it's still an important tool in the toolbox. And as I said earlier, in certain cases for collaboration or to set a North Star, goals can be really valuable. But I think we got to a place where goals and transparency were almost seen as the end in and of itself rather than a tool to accomplish something else. And I think helpful for companies to take a step back from that and to be able to say, what are we really trying to achieve? And how do we make sure the level of investment is commensurate with what we're trying to achieve? And I think sometimes we spend more time trying to get the perfect goal or trying to focus on what we can measure rather than what's the right kind of progress. We've seen this a lot, for example, in within climate, for example, where companies are focused on maybe the goals that they can control within their four walls rather than scope 3, which is where all the impact is, right? And so they talk about what they're accomplishing, but it's not really where the real meaning is. Or they don't have goals on the social side because they couldn't figure out a meaningful target that was quantifiable. And so they end up spending their time on the wrong things rather than where they're really going to have impact. So goals should be part of the solution, but I think there's a real benefit in it not being sort of the end all be all of the way we drive progress.
Absolutely. I think that makes a ton of sense, really helpful for how people can start to think about these, that, it's important to set targets to work toward them, but also really be mindful of where you're having the most impact and how you can look to reduce that. And along those same lines, as we look to wrap up, I'm wondering, companies are looking towards the wrap of their by 2025 goals. They're thinking about what their next goal set should be. I wonder what some advice you might share with them as they're looking to really identify some of those areas where they can push positive impact forward and how they can maybe set some goals that can help them to get there.
Yeah, thanks. So I think there's maybe 4 ways in which I'd advise companies now to think about their goals. And it's a really good year for it because a lot of goals are expiring in 2025. We have companies really thinking about what is that next iteration. And I would hate to see them move away from goals entirely. I don't think that's the right lesson to be learned. And so, but I do think it's a useful time to shift. And so as I've alluded to, fewer, more focused goals, really important shift. And so I really welcome that. That shift towards more achievable and even flexible, right? It's okay to say, you know what, our business model has changed. This goal doesn't make sense for us anymore. And to be honest and transparent about that, and then use that as a way to shift the goal. So achievable and flexible. I think acknowledge the dependencies and uncertainties. I've seen a lot of companies set goals that were really valuable goals, but they were so dependent on certain technologies becoming available or certain policy environments becoming available. And it doesn't mean you can hold up your hands and say, oh, there's nothing I can do about those dependencies. Certainly you have a role to play, but you also have to point those out and acknowledge the interdependencies. And then the last thing is just that focus on implementation that we were talking about earlier, right? And getting the governance, the accountabilities, the transparency, external verification, whatever is needed to ensure that there's a real implementation plan behind the goals so that you can achieve them in a meaningful way.
Fantastic. Well, I'm sure this will be super helpful for companies as they're having those conversations internally right now and really looking towards the future as by 2025 turns to by 2030 and beyond. So thank you so much for sharing your perspective. Really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much. And thanks everyone for being here.